This is Mysteryport Chronicles. I am Nathaniel Aldridge, a man who watches, listens, and records. Here in the fog and lamplight of the port, every small sign is a testament. I follow them. Evelyn writes them down, and together we bring truth to light. Let us begin. The Grand Theater stood as an architectural counterpoint to the working docks, all velvet and gilded balconies, smelling of perfume, dust, and dramatic expectation. Tonight, however, the air held a different scent: panic. It was 10 minutes before the final act of the sea siren, and the principal baritone, Signor Matteo Rossi, was missing. Rossi was a man whose reputation preceded his voice, a powerful, temperamental figure known for his exceptional talent and his extreme paranoia concerning hygiene. He demanded silence and sterilization around him, fearing germs more than any critic. The theater manager, a sweating man named Mr. Finch, no relation to the clockmaker, found me at my office and led us through the labyrinthine passages backstage. "Mr. Aldridge, Miss Hart," Finch gasped, his voice raspy with fear. "He is gone! Poof! Vanished into thin air!" Evelyn, always observant of the human drama, noted the manager's distress was rooted in finances, not concern for the artist. She opened her notebook, the pen hovering. "I'm Evelyn Hart," she murmured, her voice adapting to the theatrical acoustics. "I write what he sees and ask what he cannot ask, and tonight I suspect the applause has ceased for a tragic scene." We were led to Rossi's dressing room. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of his preferred disinfectant, a sharp, medicinal smell that burned the nostrils. "The police are already focusing on the window," Finch whispered. I looked at the window. It was high, leading to a sheer, wet brick alley, 2 stories above the ground. The glass was latched from the inside. "The window is a distraction, Mr. Finch," I stated. "Signor Rossi was not interested in heights, only in isolation. We must examine the room." The dressing room was a study in neurotic control. Every towel was folded, every makeup stick capped. The only item out of place was a silk glove lying on the Persian rug. Rossi was known to never wear silk, too delicate, too prone to accumulating dust. He preferred thin, utilitarian cotton. "This is not his," I stated, picking up the glove with the tip of my pencil. "It is a woman's." "The opera is full of women, Mr. Aldridge," the manager pointed out. "This glove smells faintly of lavender and a very specific stage makeup, the kind used for the chorus, not the principal soprano," Evelyn noted, leaning closer. "It belongs to someone used to waiting in the wings." The door to the corridor was the only other exit. It was locked from the outside by the manager himself, who held the only key. "The manager confirms the door was locked when the baritone was discovered missing," Evelyn observed. "The window is latched. If the baritone did not possess a secondary key, the disappearance is impossible." I ignored the impossibility. I focused instead on the pervasive medicinal scent. "The disinfectant," I noted, inhaling deeply. "Rossi's fear of germs is widely known. He doused the room. Yet the scent is strongest near the fireplace mantel." I ran my finger along the cold brass mantelpiece. The metal was dusty, but beneath a thin layer of grime I felt a slight residue, a faint oily smudge that contrasted with the powdery stage makeup. "Oil," I muttered. "Theatrical makeup grease? No, machine oil, and a fine, almost invisible line of abrasion here." The room was locked, but the world had entered through an invisible mechanism, leaving a trail of oil and a feminine glove. I began a methodical sweep of the room, utilizing my knowledge of geometry and human habits. If a man was compelled to leave a room sealed from within, the room must contain a hidden flaw, a structural weak point that had been temporarily utilized. The door was locked. I examined the latch mechanism itself. It was sturdy, the screw heads undisturbed. The key was indeed required. The window was similarly secured. The fireplace was a possibility, but the chimney was narrow and clean. Rossi was not a chimney sweep. I returned to the mantelpiece and the tiny line of abrasion I had found. I used my magnifying glass, tilting it under the weak gaslight of the dressing table. The mark was incredibly fine, consistent with a thin, taut cord rubbing repeatedly against the sharp brass edge. "Evelyn," I instructed, "assume the door was locked from the outside. Assume for a moment that the key the manager holds is the only key. How could the baritone exit and then, hypothetically, lock the door again or make the manager believe it was locked?" "The key is redundant if the baritone never left through the door," Evelyn deduced. "He was taken before the lock was engaged, or he has an accomplice who locked it afterward. Or the manager is lying. But let us eliminate the variables of human deceit first. Let us focus on physics." The door was ruled out. The window was ruled out. My gaze fell upon the ceiling. It was plastered, ornamental, with a ventilation grate near the corner where the room was warmest. I retrieved a wooden chair and stood upon it, reaching for the grate. "Rossi's obsession with germs is the key," I explained, pulling gently at the metal lattice. "He would naturally check the ventilation first, insisting it be scrubbed regularly. Therefore, he or his cleaner would know exactly how it was secured." The grate was held by 4 long screws. I pulled my pocket-knife and tested the heads. They were dusty and untouched, but the surrounding plaster was subtly different. The screws are original, but the grate itself is slightly warped, and here, along the edge of the plaster, I scraped a microscopic sample onto a piece of paper. It was not plaster. It was a mixture of soapstone powder and white grease paint, the kind used to fill in hairline cracks on plasterwork on a theatrical budget. "The screws were merely for show," I stated, descending from the chair. "The grate was secured with a temporary paste of cheap grease paint, easily cut or broken from the inside. The true escape route was the ventilation shaft." The oil on the mantelpiece, I realized, was left by the friction of the metal grate as it was moved. The abrasion was left by a thin rope dropped through the gap to retrieve the grate from the floor after the baritone had entered the shaft. The shaft led to the roof, or more likely, runs directly above the stage lighting grid. A man obsessed with air purity knew exactly where that vent led. The trace of oil on the mantel, not grease paint, indicates that someone climbed through that shaft repeatedly, someone who works with machinery or ropes. The case was no longer about a ghost, but about a practical mechanical escape route known only to an insider. The question now was who facilitated the flight and why they left a woman's silk glove as a misleading sign. With the physical impossibility solved, Evelyn focused on the emotional tapestry of the opera house. Signor Rossi, we learned, was a terrible man. His voice was golden, but his heart was iron. "The baritone was not being threatened, Nathaniel," Evelyn reported after speaking with a stagehand. "He was the threat. He had a brief, sordid affair with a young soprano, Miss Amelia Vane. Amelia Vane was a stunning talent, a newcomer. Rossi, fearing her rising star, had begun to sabotage her career. He threatened to ruin her reputation, to have her fired, unless she gave up her debut role in the next production, a role he coveted for a protégé, Evelyn elaborated. The manager, Mr. Finch, confirmed the tensions. Signor Rossi was impossible. He knew she was better than him. He needed her silence. And Miss Vane, she has a brother, a good man, but a dock worker, a fisherman. The information clicked into place. A fisherman, used to ropes and knots, dealing with a baritone obsessed with control. The silk glove, I stated, the lavender scent, it belongs to Miss Vane, but the oil on the mantel belonged to her brother. The glove was left deliberately. A distraction placed by the brother after the fact to send the police chasing romantic rivalry among the chorus girls, Evelyn agreed. The baritone had vanished, aided by the enraged brother of his victim, but the motive for the disappearance was still murky. Why simply make him vanish, leaving a trail of panic when revenge was the clear motive? Evelyn, using her professional access, located Miss Amelia Vane backstage, hidden in the shadows of the costuming department. The young soprano was adjusting the lace on her costume, her hands trembling. "Miss Vane?" Evelyn addressed her gently, noting the deep circles under her eyes. "We know about the threats from Signor Rossi, and we know about your brother, Thomas." Amelia's eyes flashed with fear, then resolution. "Thomas would never hurt a fly. He loves the sea. He only came here to see my performance." "We believe Thomas helped Rossi disappear, but not to kill him," Evelyn said, leaning against a rack of heavy velvet cloaks. "Rossi was going to ruin you, but disappearing him now would ruin the opera, ruin the premiere, and ruin your chance to shine. It doesn't make sense." The environment of the theater was itself a character, a world defined by hierarchy, beauty, and ruthless competition. Amelia, despite her talent, was always aware of her fragile position. "You have talent, Miss Vane. You do not need to fight dirty." Amelia finally broke down, the stage composure dissolving. "It was his voice, Miss Hart. He was afraid of my voice. He was so desperate to protect his reputation, his longevity. He told me he would prove I was nothing." Evelyn waited, letting the stage silence speak for itself. "Thomas didn't hurt him," Amelia confessed, wiping her tears. "He did help him leave, but it was Rossi's idea. He came to Thomas last night, terrified. Rossi confessed he had made a terrible financial wager, a catastrophic one. He planned his own disappearance to escape his creditors, not just to spite me. Rossi hadn't been threatened by a fisherman. He had hired him. He needed a sturdy, discreet man who knew the high places and the knots," Evelyn summarized. "And he used your brother's anger against him, leveraging the shame of the threats he'd made against you, convincing him he was rescuing you both." Amelia nodded miserably. "Rossi gave Thomas money to ensure his silence, then had him come through the vent, pretend to struggle, and lock the room from the inside with a small, specialized tool, a simple loop on a thin line, before exiting the way he came. Rossi left the glove as a theatrical flair, a false clue to delay the police." The truth was grotesque. The baritone, a master manipulator, had faked his own disappearance, using the very man whose sister he had tormented. The entire disappearance was a grand, cowardly performance to escape debt. Evelyn, using her professional access, located Miss Amelia Vane backstage, hidden in the shadows of the costuming department. The young soprano was adjusting the lace on her costume, her hands trembling. "Miss Vane," Evelyn addressed her gently, noting the deep circles under her eyes. We know about the threats from Signor Rossi, and we know about your brother, Thomas." Amelia's eyes flashed with fear, then resolution. "Thomas would never hurt a fly. He loves the sea. He only came here to see my performance." "We believe Thomas helped Rossi disappear, but not to kill him," Evelyn said, leaning against a rack of heavy velvet cloaks. "Rossi was going to ruin you, but disappearing him now would ruin the opera, ruin the premiere, and ruin your chance to shine. It doesn't make sense." The environment of the theater was itself a character, a world defined by hierarchy, beauty, and ruthless competition. Amelia, despite her talent, was always aware of her fragile position. "You have talent, Miss Vane. You do not need to fight dirty." Amelia finally broke down, the stage composure dissolving. "It was his voice, Miss Hart. He was afraid of my voice. He was so desperate to protect his reputation, his longevity. He told me he would prove I was nothing." Evelyn waited, letting the stage silence speak for itself. "Thomas didn't hurt him," Amelia confessed, wiping her tears. "He did help him leave, but it was Rossi's idea. He came to Thomas last night, terrified. Rossi confessed he had made a terrible financial wager, a catastrophic one. He planned his own disappearance to escape his creditors, not just to spite me. Rossi hadn't been threatened by a fisherman. He had hired him. He needed a sturdy, discreet man who knew the high places and the knots," Evelyn summarized, "and he used your brother's anger against him, leveraging the shame of the threats he'd made against you, convincing Thomas he was rescuing you both." Amelia nodded miserably. "Rossi gave Thomas money to ensure his silence, then had him come through the vent, pretend to struggle, and lock the room from the inside with a small specialized tool, a simple loop on a thin line, before exiting the way he came. Rossi left the glove as a theatrical flair, a false clue to delay the police." The truth was grotesque. The baritone, a master manipulator, had faked his own kidnapping, using the very man whose sister he had tormented. The entire disappearance was a grand, cowardly performance to escape debt. With the financial motive established, I returned to the vent. Rossi had not fled the building. He had hidden within it. A man so germ-phobic would not simply disappear into the damp, rat-infested underbelly of the theater. He needed a place of pristine isolation. The ventilation shaft was the key. It ran directly above the enormous, heavily insulated chamber that housed the main heating and filtration system, a room no one ever entered save for the engineer. A warm, clean, sterile room. "Rossi is in the theater's core," I announced to Evelyn. "He is likely in the filtration room, waiting for the performance to finish before making his dramatic escape." We found the engineer, a man named Jones, nervously sweeping the lobby. He denied all knowledge. "Mr. Jones," I said, displaying the small vial of machine oil I had recovered, "this oil is a specialty blend. It is used on the main shaft pulleys in the filtration room, which happens to be the only room in the entire theater that is entirely dust-free and perpetually warm, a perfect hiding spot for a germ-phobic fraud." Jones paled. He recognized the oil. "Rossi paid him a small fortune," Evelyn added, "to keep the room secured and to look the other way." We entered the filtration room. The air was dry, humming with the constant churn of the machinery. And there, tucked behind a massive copper filter unit, sat Signor Rossi. He was dressed in clean stage clothes, wearing his thin cotton gloves, quietly reading a newspaper. He looked up at us, his expression not fear, but wounded arrogance. "Mr. Aldridge," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "A theatrical flourish. I merely required some solitude to compose myself after a particularly taxing run." "You required solitude to escape a substantial debt, Signor Rossi," I corrected him. "You staged your own kidnapping, used a young man's desperate loyalty to his sister, and disrupted the entire opera." Evelyn stepped forward. "You lied, Signor. You leveraged Thomas's love for his sister to ensure your own financial safety. The disappearance was not an act of artistic temperament. It was an act of profound cowardice." Rossi's voice, which could fill a stadium, cracked with bitterness. "The baritone always needs an audience, Miss Hart, even for his failures." Rossi was escorted from his hiding place, denying all accusations of financial impropriety until the very moment he was delivered into the hands of his awaiting creditors. His performance was over. Thomas Vane was cleared of any wrongdoing beyond simple deception. His intent was purely to protect his sister. Amelia Vane, freed from the baritone's tyranny, took the stage for the final act of the sea siren, her voice soaring with newfound, genuine freedom. The entire incident was a study in theatrical fraud. The most significant performance was not on the stage, but the elaborate deception enacted by a man whose vanity outweighed his honor. Back in our office, the silence was a welcome relief from the theater's constant clamor. Evelyn finished her notes. "What shall we call this one?" she asked me. "The Missing Baritone," I replied. "A man who vanished into his own fear." Evelyn wrote, "Case File 005, resolved. Leçon. The greatest performances are often the ones staged off-stage. When ego becomes the conductor, vanity is the only visible clue." I watched the smoke curl from my pipe, reflecting on the baritone's final hollow act. "A performance of profound cowardice," I summarized. "And a tragic waste of a good voice," Evelyn added, closing her notebook with a quiet snap. "Perhaps," I conceded. "Case File 005 is closed. But in the fog of mystery port, another lantern always waits to be lit."